At 4:12 in the afternoon on July the 22nd, 1944, Gefreiter Werner Schmidt stepped off a train at Skipton Station, Yorkshire, expecting brutality. What he found instead was a compound with football pitches, cinema showings, and fresh Yorkshire pudding served every Sunday. 23 years old, captured in Normandy 5 weeks earlier, veteran of 18 months fighting in France. The train had carried 380 German prisoners of war from the southern processing centre to northern England. Most of them had spent the journey staring out windows at a countryside that looked nothing like the devastated France they had left behind. Schmidt's commanding officer, Obergefreiter Karl Zimmermann, had told the men to prepare for starvation conditions, beatings, starvation rations, forced labour in coal mines. The British would take revenge for the Blitz. Geneva Convention meant nothing when cities were burning. What Zimmermann didn't know was that within 4 weeks his men would be eating better than they had eaten in 2 years, watching British films in heated barracks, and some of them would be writing letters home describing Yorkshire as the safest place they had ever lived. The lorries from Skipton Station reached Camp Eden at 4:55 that afternoon. The camp covered 450 acres of Yorkshire moorland. Guard towers stood at each corner. Chain-link fences surrounded the perimeter. Inside the fences, rows of Nissen huts stretched in organised rows. The layout looked military, proper, exactly what Schmidt expected from a prisoner camp. Then he saw the football pitch, a real grass pitch, goals at each end, white lines freshly painted. German prisoners were playing a match. Others sat on the sidelines watching. Guards stood near the fence, but they weren't pointing weapons at the players. They were smoking cigarettes, talking quietly, rifles leaning against the fence posts. Schmidt turned to the man beside him. Schütze Peter Hoffmann. Hoffmann had been captured at the same time. Same battalion, same chaos near Caen. Hoffmann was staring at the football pitch with his mouth half open. Neither man spoke. The lorry stopped at the processing hut. British guards ordered the prisoners out. The guards carried rifles, but their manner was formal, not aggressive. They directed the men into queues, checked names against typed lists, assigned hut numbers. The entire process took 35 minutes. No shouting, no violence, just military procedure. At 5:45, Schmidt and Hoffmann were led to Hut 9. The building was corrugated steel, recently painted, smelling faintly of disinfectant. Inside were rows of iron beds, each with a mattress, blanket, and thin pillow. Small wooden lockers stood beside each bed. The floor was concrete, but swept clean. Windows along both sides provided light and air. Schmidt had expected wooden bunks and lice-infested straw. This looked cleaner than some German barracks he had known during training. An older German prisoner approached them. Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, captured at El Alamein in November 1942. Weber had been at Camp Eden for 19 months. He explained the camp schedule. Wake up at 6:30 a.m. Breakfast at 7 o'clock. Work parties departed at 7:45 for local farms and factories. Those not assigned to work had free time. Lunch at midday. Afternoon work or recreation. Dinner at 5:30 p.m. Evening activities until 9 o'clock p.m. Lights out at 10 p.m. Schmidt asked about the work. Weber said most prisoners worked on farms helping with harvest, or in textile mills doing basic manufacturing. The work was hard, especially during harvest season, but the pay was 6 pence per day in camp tokens. The tokens could be spent at the canteen, buying cigarettes, toiletries, sweets, occasionally chocolate. Hoffmann asked about the football pitch. Weber smiled. The prisoners had levelled it themselves 8 months ago. The camp commandant had approved the project. British Army engineers provided tools and materials. Prisoners provided labour. The pitch opened in December. It was available every evening after work details returned, and all day Saturday. Schmidt asked about the guards. Weber said they were mostly home guard. Men too old for frontline service or soldiers recovering from wounds. Some guards were decent, others were cold but fair. None were sadistic. The camp followed Geneva Convention protocols precisely. International Red Cross inspectors visited every 3 months. Violations were investigated. Schmidt struggled to process this information. He had expected something entirely different, not comfort, not fairness, not dignity. At 5:45 that evening, Schmidt and Hoffmann joined 380 other prisoners in the mess hall for dinner. The meal included sausages, mashed potatoes, cabbage, brown bread with margarine, and tea. Dessert was stewed apples with custard. Schmidt ate cautiously, expecting the food to be insufficient or spoiled. The food was neither. Guards walked through the mess hall, but they didn't interfere with the prisoners or touch their rations. Hoffmann finished his meal and asked the German prisoner serving if there was more. The server said yes and gave him another sausage. Schmidt asked Weber if the food was always like this. Weber said yes, sometimes better on Sundays. The camp received British military rations, meat 3 times a week, fresh vegetables when available, dairy products. The cooks were German prisoners who had worked in hotels before the war. They made the rations stretch. After dinner, Weber took Schmidt and Hoffmann on a tour of the camp. They walked past the recreation hut where prisoners were playing table tennis and drafts, past the small library with shelves of German books donated by the Red Cross and local churches, past the carpentry workshop where prisoners made small items for camp use, past the cinema hut. Schmidt stopped at the cinema. It was a Nissen hut, larger than the sleeping quarters, with benches arranged in rows and a white sheet hung at one end. Weber explained that prisoners had converted this hut 6 months ago. The camp commandant had agreed. The cinema had seating for 200, a projector operated by British technicians, and a screen for showing films. Every Friday evening, the camp showed films. British films mostly, some American films, occasionally German films approved by British authorities. Schmidt asked if the films were propaganda. Weber said no, just regular British entertainment. Last week they had shown The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, the week before In Which We Serve. Prisoners could attend for free. Attendance was voluntary. Usually 300 or more prisoners came. Hoffmann asked if the British censored the content. Weber said the British chose which films to show, but they chose recent releases, popular films, the same films showing in British cinemas. The guards wanted prisoners to understand British values, British resilience, British character. The films showed a nation under siege but refusing to break, a people with humour, determination, resources. That night, Schmidt lay in his bunk trying to understand what was happening. The bed was adequate. The hut was heated by a coal stove in winter, ventilated in summer. The food was better than Wehrmacht field rations. The treatment was correct. None of this matched his expectations. He had fought British soldiers in Normandy. He knew they could be fierce, ruthless when necessary. But this was different. This was deliberate civility. Schmidt suspected the British had a strategy. Keep prisoners healthy, keep them compliant, reduce escape attempts, reduce resistance. It was working. Most prisoners seemed resigned. Some even seemed relieved. On July the 26th, 4 days after arriving, Schmidt was assigned to a work detail. 15 prisoners loaded into a lorry at 7:45 a.m. and drove to a farm 8 miles from camp. The farmer, a man named Arthur Whittaker, met them at the barn. Whittaker was in his late 50s, lined face, calloused hands. He explained the task. The wheat needed harvesting. The prisoners would work the fields with scythes and rakes, gathering wheat into bundles. The work would last until 4:30 p.m, with a break for lunch. Whittaker would provide water and a place to rest. The work was exhausting. Yorkshire sun in late July reached 80 degrees by mid-morning. Schmidt's hands blistered within 2 hours. His shoulders ached from swinging the scythe. But Whittaker kept his promise about water and breaks. At noon, the prisoners stopped for lunch. Whittaker's wife brought food: cheese sandwiches, pickled onions, cold tea. The prisoners ate in the shade of a stone wall at the field edge. Whittaker sat with them and talked. He asked about Germany, about their families, about how they had been captured. His questions were curious, not accusatory. Schmidt answered carefully. He didn't want to say anything that sounded like Nazi propaganda or justification for the war. Whittaker said his son was fighting in Burma. Royal Engineers, building bridges under Japanese fire. Whittaker checked the wireless every evening for news from the Far East. He read the casualty lists in the newspaper every morning. He said he didn't hate German soldiers. They were men following orders, same as his son. The war was politicians doing, not soldiers. Schmidt didn't know how to respond to this. In Germany, enemy soldiers were enemies. No exceptions, no sympathy. Whittaker was treating them like human beings who happened to wear different uniforms. The work detail returned to camp at 5:15 p.m. Schmidt was exhausted, sunburned, filthy, but he felt strangely satisfied. The work had meaning. The farmer treated them fairly. The pay would accumulate in his camp account. At dinner that night, Weber asked how the first day went. Schmidt said it was hard but manageable. Weber said it would become easier. The body adjusted. Most prisoners preferred work to idleness. Work gave structure, purpose, and the farmers usually treated them decently. Some farmers even gave prisoners eggs or vegetables at season's end. On Friday, July the 28th, Schmidt attended his first film at the camp cinema. The film was The Bells Go Down, a drama about London firefighters during the Blitz. The cinema was packed. Prisoners filled every bench. Guards stood at the back, but they seemed more interested in watching the film than monitoring the prisoners. The film started at 7 o'clock p.m. For 90 minutes, Schmidt watched British actors, British courage, British suffering. The film showed London burning, firefighters running into collapsing buildings, civilians trapped in rubble, people dying while trying to save others. The film didn't glorify war. It showed exhaustion, fear, grief. But it also showed determination. The British in the film refused to surrender, refused to despair. When the film ended, the prisoners sat quietly for a moment. Then someone began clapping. Others joined. Soon, the entire cinema was applauding. Not because the film was propaganda, but because it was honest. It showed war's cost without demanding revenge. Schmidt clapped too. He felt peculiar doing it. He was a prisoner of war, applauding a British film about British suffering caused partly by German bombs. But the feeling was genuine. 2 weeks later, on August the 12th, something unexpected happened. A guard approached Schmidt during afternoon free time and asked if he wanted to go to town. Schmidt thought he misunderstood. The guard repeated the question. A group of 4 prisoners was being taken to Skipton for a film at the local cinema. The camp cinema only showed films every 2 weeks. The town cinema showed films twice weekly. Prisoners who demonstrated good conduct could attend as a privilege. Schmidt would be accompanied by 2 guards, but otherwise, the experience would be identical to any civilian attending a film. Schmidt said yes immediately. At 6:30 p.m., he joined 3 other prisoners and 2 guards in a lorry. They drove 8 miles to Skipton. The town was small, perhaps 12,000 people, one main high street with shops and businesses. The cinema was called the Regal. It had a marquee with bulbs spelling out the current film. This Happy Breed, a Noel Coward drama. The guards purchased tickets. Schmidt and the other prisoners walked inside. The lobby had posters, a kiosk selling sweets and cigarettes, carpet underfoot. It looked exactly like cinemas Schmidt had visited in Hamburg before the war. The guards bought barley sugars and offered some to the prisoners. Schmidt took one. They entered the auditorium and sat toward the back. British civilians were already seated. Families, couples, elderly people. Some glanced at the prisoners. The guards wore uniforms, so the prisoner status was obvious, but no one objected. No one left. The lights dimmed and the film began. For 2 hours, Schmidt sat in a Yorkshire cinema, watching a British film surrounded by British civilians, while Britain was at war with his country. The absurdity of it made him want to laugh. Hoffman, sitting beside him, heard the suppressed laugh and whispered, "What's amusing?" Schmidt whispered back, "All of this." After the film, the guards took the prisoners to a tea room for refreshments. The shop was called Maggie's. It had small tables with checkered cloths and a counter with cakes under glass domes. The guards ordered tea and scones for everyone. The woman serving, perhaps 50 years old, treated them without hostility. She served the prisoners the same as any other customer. Schmidt ate the scones slowly, spreading butter and jam carefully. He hadn't tasted jam since 1942. Germany had rationed sugar severely early in the war. Luxuries like jam vanished. Here in Yorkshire, in the middle of a war, jam was common enough to serve prisoners. The lorry returned to camp at 10:30 p.m. Schmidt walked to his hut, feeling disoriented. The cinema, the barley sugar, the scone, the civilians who accepted their presence without hatred. None of it matched his understanding of how wars functioned. Enemies were supposed to despise each other. Prisoners were supposed to suffer. Instead, he was being treated better than he had been treated as a soldier in the Wehrmacht. Over the following months, Schmidt settled into camp rhythm. He worked on farms 5 days weekly. He played football on weekends. He attended films every Friday. He gained 15 pounds between July and October. His health improved. His hands roughened from farm labour. He learned basic English from guards and farmers. Some guards were approachable enough for conversations. They discussed football, weather, families, rarely the war. The war was something happening elsewhere to different people. Inside Camp Eden, the war felt remote. In September, the camp organised a football league. 6 teams, 1 from each section of huts. Schmidt played striker for Hut 9. The league lasted 6 weeks. Guards attended matches and supported their preferred teams. The final match drew 600 spectators, prisoners and guards together. Hut 4 won. The camp commandant presented a wooden trophy made in the carpentry workshop. Schmidt's team finished second. After the final match, the camp held a tea with sandwiches, cakes and limited beer. The beer was rationed, 1 bottle per prisoner, but it was real ale brewed locally. In October, Schmidt received a letter from his sister in Hamburg. The letter had taken 4 months to arrive, routed through Red Cross channels, censored by German and British authorities. His sister wrote that Hamburg had been bombed catastrophically. Operation Gomorrah in July 1943 had destroyed half the city. Their parents had survived but lost their home. They lived with relatives now. Food was desperately scarce. Ration cards provided barely survival levels. His older brother had been killed in Russia. His younger sister worked in a munitions factory. His sister asked if he was being treated humanely. She had heard conflicting reports about British prison camps, some positive, some terrible. She wanted truth. Schmidt wrote back the same day. He told her he was safe, healthy, working on a farm, eating adequately. He didn't mention the cinema or the football or the scones with jam. He worried she wouldn't believe him. Or worse, she would believe him and resent that he lived comfortably while Hamburg starved. He kept the letter factual, brief, neutral. He said the British followed Geneva Convention standards. He said he hoped the war would end quickly. He said he missed home, but was surviving. By November, Schmidt had earned enough camp tokens to buy cigarettes, soap, and a few books from the canteen. The canteen sold German books, donated by the Red Cross and British German societies. Schmidt bought a collection of Goethe's poetry and a novel by Erich Maria Remarque. He read in the evenings after dinner. The library also offered English books, and some prisoners were taking English lessons taught by other prisoners who had studied in England before the war. Schmidt joined the lessons. Learning English seemed sensible. He didn't know when the war would end or what would follow, but knowing English couldn't harm his prospects. In December, something shifted. News reached camp that Allied forces had crossed into Germany. The Ardennes offensive had failed. Germany was retreating on all fronts. The camp atmosphere changed. Some prisoners became withdrawn, despondent. Others became more accepting, planning for post-war life. A few prisoners, mostly older men who had lived in Britain before the war, began discussing staying in Britain permanently. This talk was risky. Guards discouraged it, but the conversations occurred anyway, quietly in corners of huts or during walks around the perimeter. Schmidt wasn't certain what he wanted. Returning to Germany meant rebuilding a destroyed nation under Allied occupation. Staying in Britain meant abandoning family, culture, language. But Britain offered opportunities Germany couldn't provide. Work, food, stability. Schmidt had seen Yorkshire farms. He had seen British resilience. He had seen how British people lived. Even during wartime rationing, British civilians had more than Germans had during peacetime. On January 10, 1945, Schmidt attended another film in Skipton. This time the film was Henry V, Laurence Olivier's Shakespeare adaptation. The cinema was crowded with locals marking the Christmas season. The guards purchased tickets again. After the film, the guards took the prisoners to Maggie's tea room. The woman serving remembered them from previous visits. She asked how they were managing. Schmidt answered in halting English. She smiled and said his English was improving significantly. She served them Victoria sponge cake this time instead of scones. Schmidt had never tasted Victoria sponge before. It was light, sweet, filled with jam and cream. Hoffman finished his in seconds and asked if he could have another slice. The guard said yes and paid for it. On the drive back to camp, Schmidt asked the guard why British people treated prisoners so well. The guard, a corporal named Davies from Wales, considered the question for a moment. Then he said Britain believed in the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were soldiers who had surrendered. They deserved humane treatment. Davies said he had a cousin fighting in Germany. He hoped German forces would treat British prisoners the same way. Schmidt didn't mention that German treatment of British prisoners varied enormously. Some camps followed standards, others didn't. Davies probably knew this already. By March 1945, Camp Eden held over 3,200 prisoners. New prisoners arrived regularly as Allied forces advanced through Germany. The camp expanded to accommodate the population. New huts were constructed. The football pitch was improved. A second cinema hut was built. The camp orchestra grew to 28 members. They performed concerts every Saturday evening. The orchestra played German classical music, British folk songs, popular tunes from both nations. Some guards attended the concerts. They sat at the back and listened respectfully. In April, Schmidt was transferred to a different work detail. Instead of wheat harvesting, he worked for a dairy farmer named Robert Thornton. Thornton ran a dairy operation on 300 acres north of Skipton. The work involved milking cows, maintaining fences, cleaning barns. Thornton was a quiet man who spoke infrequently but treated his workers fairly. He paid prisoners the standard rate and provided lunch daily. His wife made sandwiches and brought them to the barn at noon along with tea. Thornton had 3 sons in the military. One was in the Royal Navy serving on a destroyer in the Atlantic. Another was in the RAF flying bombers over Germany. The third was in the army fighting in Italy. Thornton never mentioned his sons directly, but Schmidt learned about them from Thornton's wife. She talked more than her husband. She asked prisoners about their families, their homes, their lives before conscription. She seemed genuinely interested. Schmidt told her about Hamburg, about his family, about working in his father's insurance office before the war. She listened and nodded and said she hoped the war would end soon so everyone could return home. In May, news reached camp that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was finished. Prisoners at Camp Eden assembled in the main yard to hear the announcement. The camp commandant explained that repatriation would begin within months. Most would be home by late 1946. Schmidt stood in the yard with 3,200 other prisoners and felt hollow. Germany was defeated. His country was destroyed. His family's situation was unknown. But then something unexpected happened that would alter everything. In August 1945, a young woman named Catherine Thornton approached Schmidt after Sunday church service in Skipton. Her father owned the dairy where prisoners worked. She had noticed Schmidt's efforts to learn English and his quiet manner. She asked if he would like to attend Sunday services regularly with her family. The camp commandant approved the arrangement. What began as church visits became Sunday lunches at the Thornton farm. Catherine and Schmidt talked for hours during those visits. She spoke about her dream of opening a bookshop. He discussed his interest in literature and business. By November, they were exchanging letters. In January 1946, during a Sunday visit to the Thornton farm, Schmidt asked Catherine to marry him. The guard was present but standing far enough away not to overhear. Catherine said yes. They both understood the complications. Schmidt was still a prisoner of war. Germany and Britain had only recently stopped fighting. Marriage would require permissions, documentation, bureaucracy, but Catherine was determined. Her father supported the decision. He said Schmidt was a decent man who had done nothing wrong except be conscripted into the wrong army. The camp commandant was skeptical but didn't forbid it. He said marriage between prisoners and civilians was discouraged but not prohibited. Schmidt would need approval from German authorities, British authorities, and Red Cross verification. The process could take months. Schmidt said he would wait. Catherine said she would wait too. By April 1946, most prisoners were being repatriated. Schmidt was transferred to a transit camp in Southampton for processing. Catherine visited him 3 times during those months. The visits required special permissions, but her father had connections. They discussed plans. Schmidt would return to Germany, locate his family, then apply for immigration back to Britain. Catherine would sponsor him. They would marry once he returned. On June 3, 1946, Werner Schmidt boarded a transport ship in Southampton, carrying 2,400 former prisoners back to Europe. The voyage took 8 days. The ship docked at Cuxhaven, Germany. Schmidt was processed and released on June 15th. He took trains south to Hamburg. The city was ruins. His family's neighborhood was obliterated. He found his sister living in a displaced persons camp. His parents had survived. His older brother had died in Russia. His younger sister had married and moved to Bavaria. Schmidt stayed in Hamburg for 5 months, helping his parents find housing. He worked construction while applying for immigration to Britain. Catherine wrote letters every week. Her father sent affidavits. In November 1946, Schmidt received approval. He would be allowed to immigrate under special provisions for German POWs, who had demonstrated exemplary conduct and had British sponsors. Werner Schmidt arrived in Southampton on February 18, 1947. Catherine met him at the dock. They married 3 weeks later in Skipton, at the same church where they had attended services together. Schmidt became a British citizen in 1953. He and Catherine had 4 children. He opened a bookshop in Skipton using knowledge from his father's business background. The bookshop succeeded. Schmidt became a respected member of the community. Camp Eden closed in 1946, shortly after Germany's surrender. The huts were dismantled or repurposed. The land returned to moorland. Today, a small plaque stands on the roadside near the camp's original location. Most people drive past without noticing. Werner Schmidt died in Skipton, Yorkshire, on September 4, 2001. He was 80 years old. His obituary mentioned his service in the Wehrmacht, his time as a prisoner of war at Camp Eden, and his 54 years as a local bookseller. The obituary didn't mention the contradiction. A German soldier who became a British citizen, a prisoner who found home, a man who discovered that sometimes the enemy offers something worth more than victory. If this story moved you, hit that like button to help us share more forgotten histories. Subscribe and turn on notifications for stories about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family served during World War II. These stories matter. These memories deserve to be preserved. Thank you for watching and helping keep Werner Schmidt's story alive.